So in chemistry, in one of the previous lectures, we talked about how we can identify different gases and what tests can we perform to identify some of the gases like oxygen, hydrogen, carbon dioxide. So the chemistry is not just limited to the gases. So there are several ions uh, that there are some tests to identify most of the compounds in the chemistry. So we will start with some of these compounds, that how we can test them, because although this would be a little complex for now, because you might not know about several compounds right now, but uh, this would be like a reference for the next classes. It would give you two benefits. Like first would be you will get a know and a feel of what are the compounds present and which compounds are we would be dealing in the chemistry. And the second thing is how we can, of course, how we can test these different compounds. So just to make it a little interactive, uh, the title is given as the mystery of the 13 test tubes. So the objective of this lecture is to identify the contents of 13 different test tubes using a few simple tests and their mutual reactivities. So the assignment here is that you are given with 13 test tubes and you want to perform different tests to identify what kind of elements or what kinds of salts and what kinds of ions are present. Because just consider this as a forensic experiment, forensic lab, that you are given with some sample, and you are given assigned with the task to identify the ions and the compounds present in those test tubes. So in chemistry, or in like for identifying different compounds, we use different tests. It is kind of it is the most interesting topic of the chemistry when we are identifying different compounds in the labs. So some of the simple tests are the we can see the color. The transition metals tend to form a brightly colored compounds. These are the most simple tests, although they would not like clearly tell us the what kind of compound is present, but it would give us a generic idea of what kind of compounds or what kinds of ions are present in that test tube. So the first thing would be color. The transition metals tend to form a brightly colored compounds. We will see the examples later. So odor. Some compounds have very distinctive odors, smells. When tasting for odor, always remember to waft and see what waft means. So pH, universal litmus paper determine the pH of the compound. As I have already told you, litmus paper is used to measure the or to find out whether the solution is acidic or alkaline. So the fourth thing is solubility. By combining the unknowns and knowing the rules of solubility, one can determine the contents of the test tubes. So some of the combined compounds, they are not soluble in water, and some of the compounds, they are soluble in water. So by dissolving a sample of that compound in water, we can have an idea, or that would help us in determining the or identifying the ion that we are going to test. The flame test, the fifth one is flame test. The metal ions, when introduced into a flame, give a distinct emission spectrum. The color of the flame can help identify the unknown metal. So these are the basic tests. There are some advanced tests also that we do to find out what kind of ions are present. So the definitions applicable to ionic reactions. Ions are charged species. Metal tend to form cations and non-metal tend to form anions. Cations are negatively charged. Cations are positively charged and the anions are negatively charged. So the metals, because they have either one, two, or three valence electrons in their outermost shell, so they can easily lose those electrons to form a positive ion, and the positive ions are known as the cations. So metals tend to form cations, and non-metals tend to form anions. So ionic substances tend to dissolve readily in water to form solutions because they are charged particles that should electrostatically attract the corresponding end of the water dipole. The water dipole means that in the water molecule, so I will also note this as a topic for the next lecture to explain you in detail what a water dipole is. Just to give you a brief introduction for now, a water molecule has one oxygen and two hydrogen atoms. So the two hydrogen atom and the one oxygen atom create some electronegativity difference between the atoms. So that is known as the water dipole, and I will discuss this in detail in the next lecture. So ionic substances tend to dissolve readily in water to form solutions because they are charged particles. So the electronegativity change or the the dipole nature of water, like the positive and the negative portion of a water molecule would attract the cations and anions according to the chemistry of the aqueous solution. So for now, this might be a little confusing for understanding, but later when I'll tell you about the water dipole, you will understand it clearly. However, not all ionic substances are soluble in water, indicating that they do not have enough energy to break apart the ionic crystal. So, not all ionic substances are soluble in water. The cations are positively charged ions. Cations in today's experiment include hydrogen, sodium, potassium, calcium, barium, iron, copper, nickel, and Sn is I think 10. So the anions that we would be talking today are chlorine, sul- sulfur ion, nitrite. I cannot name all of them because this is sulfate ion, this is chromate ion. So we will see later what are the names of these anions. Anions are negatively charged. So we are going to test some of them. So next slide. So the term soluble means that a substance dissolves. An aqueous solution is soluble if one mixes two solutions together and no precipitate forms, then only the ions are in solution, thus there is no reaction. So the term soluble means that a substance dissolves. It means that, uh, for example, if you are dissolving salt in water, so when you dissolve, initially you can see the crystals of salt, but when you dissolve those crystals in the water, that means the salt is soluble in water. So an aqueous solution is soluble if one mixes two solutions together and no precipitate forms, only the ions are in solution, thus there is no reaction. By precipitation, it means that when two solutions are mixed, when two chemicals are mixed, if there is no formation of precipitates or there is no, as you can see in this picture, this yellow cloudy like structure being formed in the water is known as precipitate, because you can see it. So if no precipitate forms, then only the ions are in solution, so there has no reaction occurred. So if there is the formation of precipitates, we can assume that there is some kind of reaction happening. And but if there are no precipitates being formed, so there would be no reaction. Sometimes two solutions are mixed together, a reaction can occur that does not form a precipitate. In some cases, a precipitate would not form, but there would be some kind of chemical reaction that would be happening. So usually when this type of reaction takes place, there is a marked color change when the product is formed or large temperature change is observed. So in some of the chemical reactions, change can be observed by the increase in temperature of the solution, And in some of the chemical reactions, it can be seen through the formation of the precipitates. The insoluble term means that the term insoluble means a substance that does not dissolve. For example, just I'm just going to give you an absurd and vague example that like the sand particles, they do not dissolve in water, so they are insoluble in water. Precipitate, a solid beneath a liquid. If one mixes two solutions and a solid form, this is called a precipitation reaction. That means if two solutions in which there was no initially no uh, precipitates or no insoluble particles, and after mixing those two solutions, uh, s- as an insoluble particles are observed or the color of the liquid changes, so there is some kind of precipitation reaction going on. In this slide, some of the solubility rules are written that all nitrates, chlorates, and acetates of all metal are soluble. Like as I have told you earlier, that you do not need to remember all of these chemicals and all of these ions. Just a brief introduction would be enough. So all nitrates, chlorates, and acetates of all metal are soluble. Silver acetate is sparingly soluble. All sodium, potassium, and ammonium salts are soluble. All chlorides, bromides, and iodides are soluble, okay, except silver, lead, and mercury. All sulfates are soluble except barium, calcium, and strontium, lead, and mercury. Carbonates, phosphates, borates, sulfides, chromates, and acenates of potassium, sodium, and ammonium are soluble. Sulfides of barium. So these are some chemicals, some of all of the nitrates are soluble, all of the sodium. Just there are some exceptions. Most of the carbonates, most of the sulfides, some of the hydroxides are soluble, and everything else will be considered insoluble. So, except all of these, everything else will be considered as insoluble. Okay. The next uh, heading is ionic equations and precipitation reactions. Overall equation shows reactant and products and as indissociated electrically neutral compound. What does that mean? This statement, this shows that this is how we show a chemical reaction. So these two on the left side of this arrow shows the reactants or the initially the initial chemicals that we mixed, and these two on the right side of the arrow, they show the products or the final chemicals that were produced in the chemical reaction. So this is the overall equation shows the reactants and products. So complete ionic equation is a little different, not important for now. Net ionic equation, not important for now. Just these type of equations exist. So I'm going to like skim through the slides so that you can those so that you know for now that you know that there are several. So the intent is not to like that you should know all of the tests right now. This is the intent is so that you just know that all of the chemicals they can be tested by using some procedure. The remembering of procedures is not important. Remembering the names of the chemicals is not important. So ions which are not directly involved in the net ionic equations are the spectator ions. So there are different kinds of ions. Let's skip this. Let so these are the important ones now. The flame test is a procedure used in chemistry to detect the presence of certain metal ions based on each animal element's characteristic emission spectrum. As you can see in this diagram, this chemist is burning a metal and a blue flame is being produced. So the by like some of the metals, they produce colored flame. So the color of the flame changes with respect to the metal. The flame test is procedure used in chemistry to detect the presence of certain metal ions based on each metal's characteristic emission spectrum. The color of flames in general also depends on temperature. The flame test is fast and easy to perform and does not require any equipment not usually found in a chemistry lab. However, the range of detected elements is small and the test relies on the subjective experience of the experimenter rather than any objective measurements. So, this is the flame test. In this test, and a metal is burnt, and by seeing or by observing the color of the flame, we can make an initial guess, just an initial guess of what kind of, or what may be the element that we are testing. So the first one is flame test. These are the colors of flame that are produced when these metals are burnt. So this is a case study, and we are going to do this case study in the next lecture because it is a little lengthier. So see you in the next class. I think that's it for chemistry today.